Well, I'm Gary Ivey, and some of you know me. I started working on swans actually in 1979. I had a temporary job with Dr. John Corneli, who was a biologist at Malheur at that time, and I was working on a duck nesting study, and I had two trumpeter nests on. One was on my plots and one was right next to it there at Malheur, and that's when I got very interested in the species. And I actually got a job, it wasn't a wildlife job, the next year, and was stuck in an office. So I volunteered to start a study on trumpeter swans in 1980 there at Malheur. I worked as a refuge biologist there for 15 years and continuing to work on that swan flock there, which I'm going to talk about today. I also worked as a research associate with the International Crane Foundation. I did my master's and PhD on sandhill crane nesting and wintering ecology. So sandhill cranes are another species I deal with, but let's talk about swans. We're in the trend session, population trend. I'm also going to talk a little bit about history here, maybe more than you want to know. But focusing on the Malheur refuge flock. Malheur Refuge is a huge refuge in Southeast Oregon, out in the middle of a sagebrush sea. It's a huge wetland oasis, which does have trumpeter swans. I want to go back a little history though, before I get into the Malheur stuff. Most of you probably know George Melendez Wright and his associates, found that there were only 69 trumpeters left in the Yellowstone National Park and in the Centennial Valley of Montana back in 1932. They thought before that, they thought that they've pretty much gone extinct. But when they made that discovery, there was a big planning effort to move some of those swans out of that area, put them in other places like Malheur. And they also, some of those birds eventually went into zoo stock, and they used that Red Rock Lakes flock as kind of breeding stock to help spread out the trumpeter swans around the country. But a little more history there. Actually, they didn't really realize that there were 78 trumpeters still at Grand Prairie, Alberta in 1918. That became part of the Rocky Mountain population that we recognize today. We had those birds in the greater Yellowstone area. There are also Rocky Mountain birds that are kind of the subpopulation that nests in the States. And then in 1954, trumpeters were discovered breeding in Alaska. And I think it was the first aerial survey they did in 1968. They found almost 2,000 birds there. And those birds are considered the Pacific Coast population. I use this map kind of as my base here, but if you see these little blue circles I inserted here, this is Winston Baco's map from his monograph on trumpeter swans in 1960, showing the breeding distribution as best he could define it from his research, looking at diaries and literature and everything he could come up with. So we were down back in the 30s to these little relic spots on the map, from this historic great distribution we had. And what happened, most of you probably know, the fur trade came to Canada mostly. The Hudson Bay Company had ports, something like 200 all across Canada, all across that same breeding range we just saw from Winston Banco. And they like to do furs, but they also focused on swan skins because there were a lot of value in the quills on the trumpeter swans for riding. There was some bedding value from the body feathers, but the main value was the skin with the down on it, where the feathers removed. And they were selling that for adorning clothing, for collars, like a meat collar type of thing, and just decorating their costumes, but also they were used as powder puffs to put on powder makeup. And I forget the details, but there was some record where something like 22,000 swan skins were shipped in one lot to England out of one of these facilities. So they had a major impact on the historic range of trumpeter swans. And then that was followed by heavy market hunting. And I think I speculate this, but I think settlers, as they moved across the West, the American settlers, also subsistence hunting on the local breeding flock, but out west particularly, as the gold rush came in the 1850s to the west, they were soon followed by people that wanted to make money off the gold rush and the people that were here, so they started selling the meat because there wasn't any Safeways nearby, grocery stores. And this photo is actually taken in 1906 at Malheur Refuge. Malheur Refuge was designated in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt to protect the refuge from the market hunting trade. Mostly targeted, they were targeting egret feathers for the millinery trade, but also meat. And this is just one photo of this John Gimbling and his hunting pals. They are said to be the reason for Malheur Refuge establishment. It's one family of market hunters. There were two little towns at the Narrows there at Malheur, which was a spot that migration was narrowed down to this narrow corridor. And they were there for market hunting and selling the meat. Most of the meat went to the Western Oregon areas. This program's been going on since 1939 at Malheur, but it was always questioned, why are we bringing trumpeter swans to Oregon? They weren't on that original map that Banco did. But, you know, and he admitted that he didn't think his map was complete. But so I'll just kind of summarize this. There are no nesting records in Oregon before 1950s when they were found at Malheur Lake, finally, after years of introduction. But there are several records of migrants in Oregon on the Columbia River and the Willamette Valley. And actually, Lewis and Clark documented that there were lots of trumpeter swans on the lower Columbia River when he went there during his adventures. There is one late May to mid-June record of one individual in the Blitzen Valley, which is south of Malheur Lake, about 30 miles, back in 1922. That's a summer breeding season record. There's another May record near Dayton in Western Oregon in 1926, and early September 1929, which still might be considered part of the breeding season before they really migrate. There was one at Davis Lake in Central Oregon in the Cascades. To me, that suggests that there was some kind of summering flock nearby, because you have these probably non-breeders, or maybe they lost their mates or had were wandering around, but they wouldn't be far from their summering areas, and suggest there were some birds summering in Oregon, probably breeding. I wouldn't be shocked to have some records of them at Malheur Lake if we could find all the fossil evidence or details. But and then there's this guy who some of you may recognize, the famous John Muir, the founder of Yosemite National Park in the Sierras in California. I did a little research on him and read a couple of his quotes, and one of them, he talks about his favorite birds of the Yosemite Sierra. Now, this is due east of San Francisco, essentially down there in the central part of the mountains. He says his favorite birds, he says it's the caw of the Clark's crow, which is of course the nutcracker, the carunc of the crane, and then the last phrase is the trumpet of the swan, which is intriguing to me. He's suggesting there were trumpeters in Yellowstone National Park area. And then later in a different book, I found this reference where he was visiting Mono Lake, and Mono Lake's this large, right now it's a hypersaline playa type lake that's down on the east side of the Sierras in California, not far from Yosemite, but he was there before this. It's so dry and salty now because in the 1800s, the city of Los Angeles diverted all the water and sent it down to Los Angeles. So it's really changed the ecology of Mono Lake. But back before then, it was kind of a marshy, estuary, brackish wetland. And he said, I was down at the estuary at Mono Lake on June 23rd, 1853, and saw a raft of swans. He didn't say they were trumpeters, but in June, you would not have a bunch of tundra swans. You know, they're up north in the Arctic nesting that time of year. So it would have been, in my opinion, probably some non-breeding flock of trumpeters. So that's some of the history. Malheur releases, this was the first site selected to move some of the swans out of the Red Rock Lakes area in 1939. And we've learned a lot since the 40s or so, but the first few years they had the swans at Malheur. They thought, well, we don't want to lose any, so we'll fence them off and put them in this big enclosure at the big spring-fed pond at headquarters. They had 15 or 20 birds in there waiting for them to start nesting and raising young in this pond all together, and that didn't work. And so finally they released those and let them free fly. And when they started doing aerial surveys in 1955, they found 2 nests on Malheur Lake. I'll back up and talk about Malheur. This is almost 188,000 acre refuge. It's super diverse. It's got, find pointed here. It's got this big hypersaline lake. This is the Great Salt Lake of Oregon, this Harney Lake, one of them. This is the Double O Ranch here, which is a bunch of wet meadows and seasonal wetlands. It's part of the refuge. And Malheur and Mud Lakes. This is Mud Lake. There's the Narrows. Malheur Lake. Malheur's about 50,000 acre marsh when it's full, in good shape. Very high quality wetland, except for the problems they have with carp, but I'll talk more about that. And then we have a 40-mile long Blitzen Valley. The Donner und Blitzen River flows from Steens Mountain up here and brings most of the water sources here from the south to feed this system and feed the wetlands that the swans mostly use. We also have the Silvies River from the north that comes out of the Blue Mountains, but this is a wonderful place if you like to visit and see birds and wildlife. It's famous for its diversity of habitats and diversity of species. It's like Disneyland. If they're in mid to late May, you can see thousands and thousands of birds, water birds and songbirds. Very famous place in Oregon for birding. A little closer look at the lakes. Here's again Harney Lake, which has some water in it at this point, but depending on water years and so forth, this can be full or completely dry. Right now, Malheur Lake has got about maybe 100 acres of water left right about here. It's pretty dry. And then the Blitzen Valley, where most of the swans have bred. This is the South Blitzen Valley. The refuge has these large impoundments, which are greatly suitable for breeding swans. And anyway, it's a great place for swans, I believe. Historically, over the years, we've documented 30 different nest sites that trumpeter swans have used in the wetlands here on the refuge. And this map just kind of grossly summarizes where those are, mostly in the South Blitzen Valley, middle Blitzen Valley. Some of those sites aren't as high quality as others, but this just shows there's plenty of potential for breeding when you've got water there. So some things happened that affected this population trend at Malheur. The Fish and Wildlife Service, originally it was the Bureau of Biological Survey that started these restoration flocks, and Fish and Wildlife became the Fish and Wildlife Service. But in 1972, there was talk and they decided that maybe it's kind of dumb to keep feeding these guys. They were winter feeding. And if they're not going to grow on their own, maybe they can't survive. And so they stopped feeding them. They used to feed them at the pond at headquarters. And the birds had learned to winter there because they got food. And the pond, it's about 15 acres and it's got pretty good aquatics in it, and it's spring fed, so it stays open when it's really cold. Even after they winter fed, when it got below zero temperatures and freezing, the swans would move into that wetland and get through those hard weeks of super cold winter and at least get by and had fairly good survival. In 1983, we got a series of like 300% of normal precipitation in the basin, and Malheur Lake became the largest lake in Oregon. It grew to 171,000 surface acres. It flooded out 20 large ranches around the refuge, and it really decimated the wintering site for these trumpeter swans. The water was too deep, and along with that expansion, the local exotic introduced invasive common carp population exploded. This is a rotenone treatment they did in 1955 just to show you the volume of carp that can overwhelm that system. And basically they eat all the aquatics and keep everything down to just a silt bottom, and there's no food left for swans and other waterfowl. So it's a disaster. So what happened during those years, the water was high from 1983 to 1988. By 1985, trumpeters quit using headquarters and the display pond in the winter. They moved down the Blitzen Valley, 40 miles south. On February 3rd, 1988, it was 32 below at Malheur, Fahrenheit. Harriman State Park in Idaho, which is a wintering area for the Rocky Mountain birds, was 52 below. And there was pretty high mortality at Harriman because of that extreme cold. At Malheur that year, we went from an estimate of 38 in the fall to 19 the next spring. So we lost half our flock just because of that one late winter freeze. And because birds at Malheur were winter fed and taught to winter at the display pond and then shifted down to the south of the end of the refuge to winter near French Glen. They imprinted on that wintering site. They hadn't learned from their parents to migrate down to California where they've got balmy winters. They imprint on the site their parents winter them with. So any cygnets raised there imprinted on the South Pleasant Valley as their wintering site. And when it's below zero there, they have 5 Mile Spring on the West Canal. The West Canal is about as wide as one of your tables, and it stays open water for maybe an acre and a half. And so all of a sudden they had much more limited food during this harsh winter period, depending on the winter when things froze up. But that bottleneck really caused a problem for these birds. Coincidentally, John Cornelia and I started this neck collar study. We put collars on mostly cygnets, but a few adults from 1980 through 87, and marked 61 cygnets and 9 adults with the collars just to figure out. We thought maybe these birds were going somewhere. We didn't know where that was. And we found that only 2 of those birds ever left the basin. Both of them died. One got shot in Nevada and another one didn't make it through the next summer. But both those birds, from my memory, is for some reason when they were banded with their brood, they got separated from their parents. And because they weren't with their parents, showing them where to winter, they explored and they went to California and Nevada. This slide shows our analysis. Is kind of a crude analysis, but the survival for the juveniles was about 44% annual survival, which isn't great. For the 9 adults, much bigger confidence intervals, but about 47%. So the survival was a problem at Malheur, and it's because of where they're wintering and what they're choosing and their behavior. Here's the data on white birds counted in the summer at Malheur, starting in 1958. You can see there's a good increasing population trend. They quit feeding in 72. They wrote and owned the lake to kill the carp in 1978. And 79, 80, 81, the lake was in great shape for food. And then the flood hit and it basically cut off the food in the lake. You can see this drastic decline in the flock. And I was at the refuge until 1998. After I left, the staff quit doing biology. I was the biologist. I kept track of the swans and cranes, and they pretty much quit doing surveys. So the data's not great. I had to cut out some years where there was no data, but they also didn't focus on managing individual swan pair wetlands that they were important. And so actually one of the maintenance guys who ran the water was responsible, in my opinion, for killing 3 of the adult males by letting the wetlands dry up at the wrong time during the summer when they're molting, and the coyotes got them, I'm pretty sure. But we started losing birds, not just because of the wintering site, but also because less attention, but there was definitely a decreasing trend. We had 4 birds a couple of years ago, and then we were down to 3. No, we had 3, that's right. And then this last year, we're down to 2 birds left at Malheur. They're both females, mother and daughter. So we're pretty desperate. Here's a summary of the number of nests at the Malheur flock, which pretty much follows that other trend graph. It's pretty much the same story, but you can see that decline, and we're down to 0 the last couple of years. Because we saw this decline back in the 80s, we started in partnership with Oregon Fish and Wildlife when I was still at the refuge and the Swan Society. We started these proposals in 1988. We actually published a proposal here in the Swan proceedings, but we submitted it to the Flyway. In 1991, I believe it was, we got approved to do this Oregon restoration program by moving birds to Summer Lake Wildlife Area. And our idea, which is still ongoing, is to have a healthy flock at Summer Lake, which doesn't have these food limited issues in the winter, have a healthy flock there that would eventually fly the 80 miles east to Malheur and find those birds and take them to these safe havens. And so we're hoping that we keep hoping, and we've had some success with this project. It originally started in 91, went through 97, and we had some breeding in Central Oregon, not just the Summer Lake Basin, but quite a ways north and a little bit west. And then the program got stopped because of a lawsuit about listing Rocky Mountain trumpeter swans, and there was concern among the agencies if we got listed, then it would change all the dynamics, and so they stopped the program until the lawsuit got settled before 2009. That's when we got going again. So we kind of had a false start, and we're going gangbusters now, but we still haven't connected this flock to the birds. Just a quick photo of Summer Lake from Google Earth. There's a big alkali lake there, Summer Lake to the south, but the wildlife area is managed by Oregon Fish and Wildlife as a waterfowl hunting area. Here on the north end is about 18,000 acres and lots of good swan habitat, lots of good food, no carp. The Anna River is a big spring that runs about 50 degrees and keeps open water even in real harsh winters. I feel like our flock is doomed if we don't do something quick. We were planning or hoping to steal a couple subadult males from the Summer Lake flock this summer, and it just didn't work out. But I don't want to give up on malheur. I think it has great potential for breeding, not good for wintering, and we need to build a flock there that learns to go somewhere else. And so we're still advocating for that. I also want to mention that malheur is not unique. Turnbull Refuge up in Washington is another one of the original flocks. They started at malheur in the 40s, I think Turnbull in the 50s, and Ruby Lake in Nevada in the mid to late 50s, and then La Creek Refuge in South Dakota in the 60s. La Creek Refuge has been the only real successful, and the Elk Refuge. The Elk Refuge is more close tied to the Yellowstone area, so it's been successful. But La Creek Refuge has been very successful in building the High Plains flock of Rocky Mountain trumpeter swans, and they move mostly into the Nebraska sandhills. And Mark Bertriska is working with those birds. But anyway, getting back to Turnbull, a few years ago, they were down to one remaining swan, and he was alone at Turnbull for 20 years. And I think it was 2006, they called him Solo. He found a mate, and they raised a brood. In 2007, they raised another brood. 2008, winter of 2007, 2008, he died of lead poisoning. Everybody was heartbroken. She got a new mate and nested again, and they've had two pairs nesting off and on, raising a few birds, but it's not wildly successful. But there's a flock there, but it's definitely threatened. Ruby Lake, the last I heard, is they had like 4 birds left at Ruby Lake, which is down in Nevada. It's very isolated. It's west of Great Salt Lake, where a lot of the migrants are. But so we really need to either give up on these flocks, which I wouldn't advocate for, or really focus on connecting these legacy, what I call legacy flocks in Nevada and Washington, and build this connected overall Western states, Rocky Mountain population that are connected to these different sites, to build this meta population type of model where these birds, if habitat's bad somewhere, they know where the next spot is. And that's a long-term goal that we need to work on. So we need to keep furthering connectivity between our locations. A couple of the birds we marked or released at Summer Lake have shown up in the Flathead. And we're getting some movement and connection between different places. Marty and Brandon are going to talk more. I think one of them is about our GSM study and some of the migrants coming through now. But the Trumpeter Swan Society will continue to advocate for restoration efforts until we have sufficient numbers and distribution of a healthy Western flock. So I'll end there. Take any questions you have. Thank you.